Great Tusk might be the best new Pokemon from the Temporal Forces set. Right now, it's one of the best performing new decks. So that's why I wanted to answer the question, is this deck actually good? So to answer this, I looked at hundreds of Japanese deck lists and played the deck myself as much as possible. In this video, I'll be comparing this deck to past decks, talking about the best Great Tusk lists and determining exactly where it places in the meta. Let's get into it. The Great Tusk deck doesn't work like a normal attacking Pokemon deck. The goal with Great Tusk isn't to take all 6 of your prizes, but instead run your opponent out of cards remaining in their deck. This is done through Great Tusk's Ground Collapse attack. For either 2 energy or a double turbo energy, Great Tusk allows you to discard the top 4 cards of your opponent's deck, as long as you played an Ancient Supporter card that turn. We have had a ton of decks with similar effects over the years. The one closest to this is Durant. Durant's strategy in all versions was to get 4 Durant in play, recycling them over and over, and then use Devour to discard 4 cards from your opponent's deck. Now, between the 2 Durant variations that have been competitively viable, the most recent one wasn't a great deck, but it did see relevant play. Its best result ever was at the Brisbane Regional Championships, where it got 3rd place. Now, I could make an entire video on exactly why this happened, but essentially it boils down to one key reason. Lugia Vista had just dominated the previous weekend, and at the time was one of the most dominant decks of all time. Shockingly, Durant was one of the few decks that actually had a relatively good matchup into Lugia Vista, with cards like Yveltal and Yellshorn to buy free turns. So while it didn't beat many of the other decks in format, it filled a hole that almost no other deck could. And this may be something that Great Tusk is able to replicate even more sustainably. While Durant's restriction was you had to have all the Durant in play every turn, which was difficult with limited recovery in the format and a really underwhelming draw engine, all Great Tusk requires is you play an Ancient Supporter card each turn. This certainly is a big restriction, but it's not because of a lack of Ancient Supporter cards. We have 2 pretty good Ancient Supporter cards right now, the best of which is Sada's Vitality. Sada allows you to power up multiple Great Tusk at the same time while providing substantial draw support. If this deck exclusively relied on double turbo energy to attack, it would likely be incredibly flimsy, with difficulty getting attacks off. But with Sada's Vitality, you can almost ensure that later in the game you'll be able to attack with Great Tusk every turn. The other Ancient Supporter is Explorer's Guidance, which can look at the top 6 cards of your deck and pick 2 to put into your hand, discarding the rest. This is a convenient way to get energy into the discard pile while also being an okay draw supporter. It's no Research or Iono, but if you had to play any supporter, it certainly could have been worse. Alongside reading Greninja to discard more energy and draw cards, this deck is certainly capable of attacking every single turn while playing an Ancient Supporter, but that on its own isn't enough to create a great deck. If you only mill 6 times, you mill 24 cards, which out of the starting 46 after your opponent draws and puts out prize cards isn't enough to win the game on its own. Right now, every deck, from the most aggressive decks to the slowest decks, can all set up while drawing far less than 22 cards, especially when you consider cards like Iono and Super Rod, which can add cards to your opponent's deck. If you want a way to run your opponent out of cards, Great Tusk needs a way to stop your opponent from taking knockouts. Mill decks in the past have done this in many different ways. The most recent Durant deck used Yellhorn to confuse Pokemon and Creep of Toughness to get more health as the main ways to prevent knockouts and stop your opponent from attacking. And the other older Durant Mill deck used disruption cards like Pokemon Catcher, Crushing Hammer, and End to do this. Great Tusk is a little bit different from these. Durant has always had low health, but the main draw for Great Tusk is it has 140 health, which isn't especially high on its own in current competitive Pokemon, but this can be buffed by Ancient Booster Energy Capsule or Bravery Charm to get up to 200 or 190 respectively, alongside the new A-Spec Hero's Cape, which can buff Great Tusk's health by 100 to get to 240. This puts Great Tusk out of range of a ton of attackers in the format. For example, Charizard EX, Giratina V's Shred, Arceus V-Star's Trinity Nova when there's a double turbo energy on it, and Great Tusk on its own is already out of range of things like Cramorant and Sableye. Great Tusk actually has great matchups against basically any deck that has to rely on 2-hit KOs. Ideally, you're hoping to get roughly 8 or 9 attacks off throughout the game, so if they can't even kill a single Great Tusk in one hit, that seems pretty easy. And even deck lists that can one-hit KO like Chien Pao don't like having to deal with a 200 health Great Tusk every single turn, while their superior energy retrievals and super rods are being milled straight out of their deck. This is the most streamlined version of this deck I could find. It's fundamentally how Great Tusk wants to be played. This list, like many others, plays these great trainer cards. starting with Nest Ball and Artisan to get Pokemon in play. This deck generally excludes Ultra Ball in favor of cards like this because the cards in your hand are so valuable. It runs Super Rod to get back your Great Tusk into the deck after they're knocked out, which is what facilitates getting all 6 Great Tusk attacking. There's 4 Earthen Vessel to find energy, an absolute necessity for the consistency of this deck. Power Pad to get back supporters, alongside Pokegear to find your supporters consistently throughout the game. Great Tusk also always runs Counter Catcher to trap weak, high retreat cost Pokemon active, or even low retreat cost Pokemon against decks that struggle to retreat. But it's certainly up for debate how many. Even though you don't have anything as strong as Block Snorlax to stop them from retreating altogether, the idea is to at least make your opponent draw some cards to find their energy cards or switch cards to move their Pokemon out of the active. This prevents your opponent from sitting on a load of garbage, doing nothing but attacking, making them get off their ass and draw some cards, which is exactly what you want. This deck, like every other Great Tusk deck, is running Fighting Energy over Water Energy, which may just seem like it's there because Greninja isn't attacked with very often, but Great Tusk's second attack is actually a surprisingly huge part of this deck. Great Tusk's attack does 160 damage for 4 energy, which is actually enough to knock out things like Baxcalibur without a double turbo energy attached, and Roaring Moon with a double turbo energy attached, which can be helpful when your opponent is trying to get out as few Pokemon as possible. But even more importantly than this, Great Tusk can be used as a way to knock out Pokemon that challenge Mimikyu. Mimikyu is a huge, absolutely necessary card to this deck. But why? Well, Mimikyu really forces decks more than literally any other card in the format to do something. Take Charizard for example. What Charizard wants to do is simply get a Pidgeot and a Charizard EX in play, then just smash through Great Tusk, playing cards like Lost Vacuum and Boss's Orders to get around your big fat elephants. If you put Mimikyu in play, well, that's a complete diversion from their original strategy. They've got to get the Charmander, then the Charmeleon, then put some energy on it and switch it to the active, and you get the idea. It's a lot of work. And sometimes their Charmeleon only does 50 damage. So if you put a Bravery Charm on this Mimikyu, it's stalling you a lot of time. And Great Tusk can knock out the Pokemon like Charmeleon or Radiant Greninja or even Babaro that are often used to deal with Mimikyu. This deck list specifically is running more of the tools with Bravery Charm and Town Store to make sure you actually find your health buffing tools. One of the issues I personally found with this deck is with Explorer's Guidance, you don't really want to be picking tools over Great Tusk or Energy, or even supporters for following turns. So having a surplus of tools so you can discard them more often is certainly something this deck wants. The last card I wanted to talk about in this deck list is Pidgeot V. Pidgeot provides a pretty unique purpose. This deck gets down to the bottom of the deck a lot. Between Explorer's Guidance, Sada, and Greninja, you can see yourself drawing a ton of cards each turn. Far more than you are milling. But surely Power Pad and Super Rod are enough to fill up your deck every turn? Well, the answer is they should be, but when you have no cards remaining in your deck, it's really difficult to play Sada's or Explorer's Guidance. Both of these cards can only be played when you have cards remaining in your deck. So the idea is you shuffle back Pidgeot, play Sada's or Guidance to draw the Pidgeot, then use the big bird again to make sure you don't deck out yourself. This lets you activate Great Tusk to mill 4 cards at any point, even when you're down to 0 in deck. Now that was the most bare bones list of this version possible. I'm going to show you some crazy iterations of Great Tusk lists, but there's already some crazy innovation going on in Japan for the Great Tusk deck. Take this deck, the best performing Great Tusk list so far. We got top 16 at the Champions League over in Japan, which did have 2,600 players. The main thing that stands out is the Comfy. But Great Tusk clearly doesn't have many mid-game draw support issues, so why would it be in the deck? I think this is actually less about Comfy, but more about Emergency Board. When you play this deck, you'll definitely notice that starting Greninja or Pidgeot sucks. If you do, you literally have no way of attacking turn 1 without finding a way to switch. Now, the initial lists of this deck ran either 0 or 1 Emergency Board, meaning even if you play it, finding it on turn 1 going second, good luck. You want to run 2 Emergency Board to increase your odds of finding a turn 1, but it's such a terrible card if you don't start Greninja or Pidgeot that you really don't want it. So in order to justify running 2 Emergency Boards, this deck decided to cut some of the other consistency cards like the extra tools to make space for this small Comfy engine. Another interesting thing I'm starting to see more and more is not only including Bravery Charm, but expressly choosing it over Ancient Booster Energy Capsules. Bravery Charm has synergy with Mimikyu as I mentioned earlier, and the only real advantage for Ancient Booster Energy Capsule is it gives you 10 more health. There's actually very few Pokemon that hit for exactly 190 on Great Tusk. The only meta-relevant ones I can think of are Chinchino with a double Turbo Energy and 2 other energy, and Roaring Moon with exactly 12 ancient cards in the discard pile. But these are relatively niche scenarios, so I don't actually see a great reason to run all 4 of your tools as Ancient Booster Energy Capsules, when you can run some Bravery Charms instead. One of the core problems with Mimikyu is while it forces your opponent to do something, you can't really do anything while it's active. It's not a Great Tusk, so you can't mill. So what decks usually do is play one of a different non-ancient supporter so you can use it the turn you want to put Mimikyu active. For this list, that card is Eri. Eri can take item cards out of your opponent's hand. This card has a ton of different purposes. Some that I found were getting cards like Lost Vacuum and Super Rod out of Charizard's hands, which are generally the answers to Mimikyu. You can get superior energy retrievals or super rods from Tianpao, discard Roaring Moon, Lost Zone, or Arceus' switch cards to trap them by using Counter Catcher, or you can even use it against Lugia on the early turns to completely brick them by discarding Ultra Balls from their hand. It's worth noting that you can still mill one card with Great Tusk even when you play Eri, so sometimes it can be worth it to take the turn off for the full 4 mill to Eri instead. This list also runs Trekking Shoes as an additional way to draw more cards and get combos off with Great Tusk. Now for the cards this list entirely excludes. The key one is Hand Trimmer, which I personally find very interesting. Hand Trimmer is really hard to use against basically any deck that doesn't draw a bunch of cards and play Iono. As the format has progressed, it seems pretty rare that those decks even exist. Decks like Tianpao really struggle to find their one Iono without drawing through their deck, so it does seem logical to exclude Hand Trimmer entirely in favor of actual consistency cards. Especially since this list specifically is in more of a control direction. Now this list is going to be the base for every other list in this video, because it's the best performing Great Tusk list ever. The next list I'm going to show you is some form of innovation from that list, so let's talk about them. Here's another cool list. The key innovation I've been seeing in a ton of lists after the Champions League is Mawile. Ran for its tempting trap attack, stopping decks from retreating weak Pokemon. Some lists like this are even running it with Ericas to snipe Pokemon from your opponent's hand. Right now, most decks have at least one Pokemon that can be trapped. Charizard runs a bunch of useless Pokemon, and even Bibarel is pretty weak. Chien-Pao runs Bibarel, Arceus often runs Bibarel, Lugia runs Lumineon, there's a ton. And once you get rid of all your opponent's energy, something that may have been previously untrappable, like Pidgeot EX or a Lugia V, may become trappable. When you consider Mawile can have a Bravery Charm or Hero's Cape on it, it becomes evident there's a ton of Pokemon Mawile can trap without getting one shot. All of this allows you to buy a little bit more time, or in some cases win the game on the spot. Many of the decks in format right now aren't running switch cards, and even if they do, you can get rid of them through Eri and Great Tusk's Mill. This list specifically even runs Calamitous Wasteland, which can increase your opponent's retreat cost. With this, you can get some more value out of Erika's Encounter Catcher, forcing opponents to draw the stadium alongside the way to retreat. The other card that I've been seeing a lot post Champions League is Jet Energy. Jet Energy is really helpful in the early turns to get Great Tusk in the active, similarly to the effect of Emergency Board I mentioned earlier. It's especially important with Comfy. You can jet into Comfy to use Flower Selecting an extra time, or jet out of Comfy when you use it early, without having to draw one of your 2 Emergency Board. You can also use Jet Energy to move between different Pokemon like Mawile and Mimikyu, which can be really difficult otherwise. I'm a big fan of this list personally. This also continues the trend of Bravery Charm over Ancient Booster Energy Capsule, which at this point I'm convinced will be a staple when this deck comes to the West. These last few lists certainly aren't what's normal for Great Tusk right now, but they're all doing something cool or unique which could be a part of Great Tusk lists in future. This list has some unique card choices throughout, but notably plays one Penny, as a way to not only recycle Great Tusk that took damage, but also to recycle the Mimikyu over and over again against matchups where Mimikyu is really effective. When playing this deck, I've had a ton of situations come up where Penny would be good, so Penny could see play in this deck for sure. This next deck has the most intriguing concept I've seen from any Great Tusk deck. Great Tusk with a Roaring Moon in it and some Dark Energy. Great Tusk only requires 2 colorless energy to attack, so realistically you can run any energy type that you want. Since this deck runs a ton of ancient cards to begin with, from the supporters to Earthen Vessel, etc., you can use Roaring Moon to do a ton of damage to put pressure on opponents, only setting up one big Pokemon to attack. This is pretty common from a few decks like Roaring Moon and Arceus to even Lost Zone decks with Roaring Moon EX. Even having a way to set up 2 Arceus on something like Charizard can be really helpful. It is a decent space commitment because you have to probably run extra energies. Most lists are running 5 or 6 basic energy, but this one is running the full 7. And even this 7 energy count seems pretty low, with only 3 dark energy for the Roaring Moon. There also aren't nearly as many ancient cards as a normal ancient box deck. This list specifically is only running 17. So even with all 4 Great Tusk in the discard, you cap out at 240, and realistically probably much lower. It's really hard to tell if this warrants the spot, but I could see it. The final thing I wanted to talk about was not Great Tusk with a Roaring Moon, but a normal ancient deck with some Great Tusk thrown in. Notably Koraidon or Roaring Moon with some Great Tusk anywhere from 1 to 2 copies to the full 4. These decks intend to go for an attacking game plan in matchups where Tusk is insufficient, or just completely change their game plan mid-game if they decide they can win with Great Tusk. This seems incredibly smart as a way to put pressure on both the prize card count and the deck count, and decks having to think about both can make their strategy against you much worse. It doesn't even make the deck that much less consistent overall because Ancient Box already has to run Ancient Pokemon in these slots to have enough Ancient cards in their deck. This can solve the core problem Great Tusk has, which is it has some really bad matchups against fast decks that do a ton of damage without needing any setup Pokemon. Decks like Goldengo or Lugia. So having a fully inbuilt Ancient Box deck means you can at the very least even up these matchups, which honestly might be necessary for this deck going forward, if some of those decks become popular. So I really like this concept personally, and honestly it might be the solution to Great Tusk, who knows. Now, how good do I think Great Tusk will be? Well, there's no clear-cut consensus from Japan because the play rate of the deck seems to change literally every week. But here's my opinion. The Great Tusk lists we saw at the beginning of the format with no plan outside of Great Tusk don't really work. There's too many ways to beat them. But I do think Great Tusk is one of the least explored decks we have. There's so many control cards and different ways to play Great Tusk. I do think someone will solve it and make it probably a top like 5 to 8 deck in format, somewhere around where Snorlax is right now. I think one of the lesser known cards, Barbarrel, might stop this deck from ever being truly great because it's a 1-card deck that any deck already running the other Barbarrel can just slot in to beat this deck. And this deck certainly has some matchups like Lugia, which I can't really see how you would even win. But at the end of the day, being one of the few decks that can reliably beat Charizard is nothing to scoff at. I find it hard to believe there won't be at least one tournament where Great Tusk's good matchups are doing really well and Great Tusk has a chance to win or do very well at that major tournament. Even though after seeing it at first, I didn't think Great Tusk would be very good. After playing it, I think it's solid. Thanks for watching.